All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of Golf and Politics. Rob, welcome to my office. Welcome to Tulsa. We had a great time today. Rob flew in to play Southern Hills, but we're recording this on Veterans Day. And I thought, even though it won't release on Veterans Day, we can't have these political arguments. We can't even go out and enjoy a round of golf like we do without the veterans that paid the price and sacrificed to make sure that we have freedom. So, is there any veteran that in your life, Rob, that you want to honor on this podcast?
I'm going to pick two, both from the Ohio Valley. My grandpa, Michael Vignovich, from Mingo Junction, Ohio, was a Marine in Korea in the Korean War. And my uncle Tom, who you had the pleasure of
Mm,
meeting at MG Cup a couple weeks ago,
yeah.
also a Marine, Vietnam era, was a little bit too old to see combat, but Marine nonetheless. And once a Marine, always a Marine.
That's
So I
right.
want to pay tribute to them.
Well, fantastic. I want to pay tribute to my biggest client this election cycle, Gettner Drummond, arguably the most decorated combat veteran in Oklahoma. He flew the first mission of the Gulf War in 1991, received the Distinguished Flying Cross. He saved the Saudi prince. He was ordered to kill. He defied an order, was actually arrested for defying an order. They found out he was right. They were wrong. He saved the Saudi prince and had a great distinguished military career. And I hope he's the next governor. He's actually being honored as we speak in Enid, Oklahoma, with a very special award and inducted into the Oklahoma Military Hall of Fame. So I think he'd be a great governor. It's a little pitch on my podcast. If you're in Oklahoma, vote for Gettner Drummond. But
Well, I would say I hope he wins, but I don't want to hurt him.
no, yeah, just
Yeah,
keep your mouth
yeah.
shut. And then, today you flew in for one purpose only. And I was really sad for you because you've torn a ligament
Ligament.
in your wrist and you tried to still play golf at Southern Hills today. You've played Southern Hills in the past. You haven't played it since the redesign by Gil Hands. What were your thoughts today of even though you didn't get to play, you got to walk the course. What did you think?
I think it's fantastic. It's a world class course. I think it's easily in the top 50 in the world. Um, it's difficult. I think it's maybe one of the five toughest golf courses I've ever played. Even when I have a wrist. I'm worried my season might be over with this thing. I hadn't played in the last 3 weeks, and I figured I might give it a good college try today, but I could tell the minute I got on the practice tee that it was just not going to hold up. So, but golf course is awesome. It's beautiful. The renovation by Go Hands is top shelf. I mean, everything about it. You've got to be thinking from the first tee shot to the last putt. The greens are incredibly fast and difficult. If you're not hitting it perfectly out there, or if any part of your game's off, it's going to be a long day.
Yeah, and it was today for our group. The wind was blowing quite handsomely, and the greens were cut very very fast, and so yeah, it was a challenge out there today. I still can't believe they let me be a member there, and it's like I have this dream that someday they're going to realize that I'm from Weirton, West Virginia, and I shouldn't be a member, but I enjoy it, and I'm so blessed to be there and be so close to the house. But today, we have a very special guest on the show, and I can't believe it's taken this long to get him back on the show. He was actually our first guest that we ever had, our former boss on Capitol Hill, both of our first bosses that we ever had on Capitol Hill. Actually, you worked for Boehner first as an intern, right?
Yeah,
Uh,
but
First official job was with,
but Bob Ney is my first
yeah,
boss. I
that's
mean,
right.
he was the first one to pay me, so he wins the title.
So, former Congressman Bob Ney, welcome to the program. And we need to make
Oh,
this a more regular occurrence. You do a lot of this news analysis on radio stations across the country. And today we're going to talk about the shutdown. And I believe it's coming to an end. At least the Senate has voted and sent it to the House. And, there could be some unforeseen things that we don't know about, but hopefully this week the government will reopen and we'll get back to business as usual, which doesn't necessarily mean much with this Congress. And so I am going to spend some time interviewing the two of you. I will pipe in But I think we can give our listeners maybe a better inside look on what really goes on in Congress. And so, Bob, Rob, for our listeners who might not be following this closely, what are the key political dynamics that lead to a government shutting down? And what does it mean, just in plain terms, what does it mean for the government to be shut down? Bob, you want to go ahead and take that?
Yeah, can I say something about the veterans? Uh,
Oh, absolutely. Sure.
yeah, yeah. I just wanted to say just a couple of brief things. My dad, Robert Ney, and my uncle, Bill Ney, my dad was 18, my uncle was 21, and they both joined up and went to World War II together and came back, fortunately, from World War II together. And then started a career together. But they're, real big heroes of mine. I was fortunate, as you know, to have my father to the age of 99 and 3 months. He was on the USS Ware, so I used to go to a couple of those reunions, and I, just heard about the war and America and veterans, my entire life. So I was fortunate to have Dad around. That we still talked about it until 2 weeks prior to his passing. And my son is an active member of the U.S. Army Reserves. Bobby, he used to work for Matt on the campaign, and he joined at the age of 40. How he passed boot camp is beyond me, but he did. So those are a couple of my favorite veterans. But all the veterans should be honored. This November 11th marks the anniversary, November 11th, 1918, of the armistice that ended World War I. So thank you, veterans. We've got a system where we can argue with each other because of you.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And then the government
Explain the
shutdown. I was in. What's that?
Explain this in terms that our listeners that maybe aren't involved in politics can understand of what leads to the federal government shutting down.
Sure. I was involved in a shutdown myself, and when we came into Congress, we were I always call us the contract with America class, and we elected Newt Gingrich. We took the Republicans out of the 40 years of the desert, and when they weren't in control of the Congress, and we put them in control of the Congress. So we had at that time, and Matt did radio down at 105 in Jackson not too long ago. And Matt, they still quoted you actually this week because you shocked everybody down there when you said, when you do polling for your candidates, balancing the nation's budget is not up there in the top tiers whatsoever of your polling process, And
one other thing, Bob, to interject there. Another thing that's very interesting that is, especially in primaries, I don't know about the Democratic side because I don't work on Democratic campaigns, but on the Republican side, when you poll and ask, do you want a candidate for the state house or for Congress that will get things done and be effective, or do you want somebody who will never compromise? The never compromise is usually around 2/3 of the voters.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Interesting.
In a system that is entirely built around compromise.
Right. So,
right. Well, that when I was running and during my time there, because we had John Kasich and Tim Penny before me. John, of course, a lot of people know him. He ran for president. He was governor of Ohio and had been a state senator, actually, years back, member of the House. John and I served together, and we actually split a county, which both of you know, Licking County. And Tim Penny was a Democrat, and way early on, they would have votes on balancing the nation's budget, and they would barely cross 100 people, and it kept getting closer and closer. So by the time I ran, in fact, when Kasich came to me and asked me to run amongst other people at that time, he mentioned balancing the nation's budget. That was it. Well, when I was in, I can tell you guys that people would yell from parades when I walked parades, and they would say, balance that budget. I mean, that was the mantra. And if you had an opponent that wasn't on board on that, they didn't survive. So it's kind of fascinating, to see how this has progressed. And of course, I do want to note this: we actually did budgets, and that that's what came to the conclusion that we had to do a shutdown because Bill Clinton, we felt, wasn't responding. So we did a shutdown. Now, how that ended, we blinked and Bill Clinton blinked. One of the reasons we blinked, I always say, is because the Republicans in the Senate, which we referred to as the Farm, by the way, the Senate, I don't think it's changed much. The Senate blinked on it, and then Clinton knew he had a little bit of an edge. Stephanopoulos wrote in one of his books that Clinton was close to just kind of giving us, what we wanted. But point is, we both blinked, we opened the government, and we had balanced budgets together, including 1998, the first balanced budget, in a generation. Now, how does the government shut down in a nutshell? A U.S. government shutdown happens when Congress simply fails to pass a funding legislation. Now, in my day, it was known as an appropriation bill. Both of you know what those are. We passed at that time, I think, 11 or 12 bills. You had to dissect each department. You had hundreds of amendments. Everything was discussed, whether it was legal services, Head Start, Social Security, Medicare, whatever the issue was, EPA, it was all discussed. Now, when you don't pass a budget, because it stopped happening around, I think, probably 2001 after 9/11. When you don't pass a budget, you go into what's called continuing resolutions, CRs. That's what public's hearing. So anybody out there in the public or listening to this podcast, if you hear a member of Congress say, we just passed the budget, no, they didn't. They passed a continuing resolution, which is to take last year's spending, basically, and kick it down the road. Republicans get happy with defense spending. The Democrats get happy with a little bit of money for domestic spending. And they all vote for this kick the can down the road called a CR. So the government shuts down very easily when you don't meet the fiscal deadline of September the 30th. You let it lapse in funds, and you don't do a budget or you don't do a continuing resolution. And that's how we got to where we are, because they decided that it was going to shut down. The big debate is who shut the government down is the big debate. And it's actually both sides, in my opinion, in the Senate.
I've always referred to the Senate as the world's most expensive long-term care facility.
I used that today on Wisconsin radio because I've heard you say it, Rob. I did. I stole it today on Wisconsin radio.
Yeah, it's where you put on your best suit and wait to die. No, everything Congressman Ney just said is spot on. And I think when you look at the continuing resolution, I mean, continuing resolutions every single year are a sign of a system that's not working. We don't really pass budgets anymore. We don't do 2-year budgeting, 5-year budgeting, 10-year budgeting. It's not forward looking.
Right.
I mean, we're basically procrastinating to the last minute each time and then passing something with little changes. And it's really not a way that a country that's got 37 trillion in debt, and a country that's frankly, as wealthy and successful as ours is, should be operating or functioning. A business wouldn't function this way.
Right.
A family wouldn't function this way. And I also agree that it's both sides' fault for not getting to an agreement and figuring something out. I mean, for all of, President Clinton's flaws and all of Congress's flaws generally, I mean, they ended up getting where they needed to be in the 90s. And I think, frankly, in our lifetimes, the only example of real fiscal conservatism would be in that 1995 to 2000 range, where whether Bill Clinton triangulated, whether the House Republicans in that era forced him into that, they did it. They ended up reaching an agreement. And I think that's what a president should do. That's what Congress should do. Today, our biggest problem is that each party is only fiscally conservative when the other side's in charge.
Yeah.
And so when Democrats are in charge, Republicans find their fiscal conservative sea legs. And when Republicans are in charge, all of a sudden Democrats are watching the bottom of the
That's a great point. That's actually my next question. It's that both parties do talk about fiscal responsibility in different ways, I would say, but they both talk about it. What does that phrase actually mean? Is it totally meaningless at this point? It doesn't seem to be put into practice. And do we think that Congress will ever actually pass a budget again, let alone a balanced budget? I mean, is that ever going to happen?
I don't think,
Well,
go
mhm.
ahead.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah,
I was just going to say,
I don't think that uh, the public has fully felt it or digested what the type of debt we have means to them in
Sure.
real terms. And really, when you have rising debt, in a nutshell, that means that the government is borrowing more. It puts upward pressure on interest rates, and higher interest rates for each of us means the cost of money goes up. So student loans get more expensive, credit card payments, mortgages, car loans. And so as the government grows and gets bigger, it does have an effect on what each of us are able to borrow and spend to get by on a daily basis. And then from a strictly government standpoint, we're currently paying almost $1 trillion a year in interest. I mean, that's basically the entire budget of the Pentagon right now.
All right.
And that's money that's going to service debt that has already been accumulated and spent. We're not even talking about what's going to be added on. And so, we're looking at, an increase in the deficit over the next decade of $4 trillion just from what has been voted on this year. So that interest is going to grow. That's money that can't be spent each year on roads and bridges, on schools, on healthcare, on whatever it is that either of us really care
Sure.
about. That's money that's going simply to service debt. Now that debt is income to someone.
Mhm.
It could be, pensioners. It could be China.
Right.
It could be, anyone that we're borrowing money from. I mean, some of our biggest creditors aren't exactly our closest friends.
Right.
So it is in the best interest of everybody. I don't care if you're conservative or liberal. If you're liberal and you have these grand plans of increasing funding for education or for free healthcare or whatever else, there's going to be less money to do it if you don't get the debt under control. The only other thing I'll add before turning it over to Bob is um, we have to we have to figure out what it means to be fiscally conservative. We seem to have three very different definitions. The far left would say, just spend it, who cares, and tax the billionaires. Well, there are limits to how much you can do of all of that.
Right.
The far right would say fiscally conservative is just cutting taxes. And, we'll get around to the deficit and we'll borrow the difference from Arab oil states and China and et
There
cetera.
are a few far right that would say, the Rand Pauls of the world. What do
Yeah,
you consider them?
but I don't think Rand Paul has a home right now. I mean, Rand Paul has about as much of a home in his party as I do in mine.
Yeah.
Um, I tend to be more of a blue dog Democrat. My view of fiscal conservative is that you pay for what you spend. I think if we have a government program that's working and it's actually helping people, we should fund that program. I think if we don't, we should get rid of it. But I think that there are two sides to the ledger. Um, Revenue and spending. I think we need to dramatically curb spending. And I think we probably need more revenue just to stabilize where we already are. So the real driver of all of this is you have Democrats who say you can't touch entitlements, which is Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. And frankly, President Trump has taken
Right.
those off the table
Same
too.
position.
So that's where the money is. It's Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and defense. Bottom line. You can cut earmarks, you can cut all these other things, which I think is a mistake. I support earmarks for a number of reasons. Um, but if you take those things off the table and then on top of that say, you can't raise a single tax or close a single loophole. In fact, we're going to continue cutting them. Well, you're going to have higher deficits. And on the Republican side, they're taking the revenue side of the ledger off the table. So those are the two things you can do.
Mm-hmm.
You can either try to bring in more revenue or you can cut spending. Well, they're both taking spending cuts off the table, and one of them's taking revenue off the table. So we're going to be in that spiral until it gets to a point where bond markets, who, people who are out there buying our debt, start saying, we're not going to buy any more treasuries or American bonds. And if we do, we're going to charge a much higher rate of interest from you, which will mean there's less money each year that our government can spend to help people, and more and more of our tax dollars going to, frankly, are not our friends.
Yeah. So, Bob, do you think in '98, when y'all balanced the budget, was it because of the political will of the American people that wanted the budget balanced, and maybe it's the American people aren't putting pressure on members of Congress and the White House to do that in 2025? Is that the case, or am I missing something here?
Well, no, I think it's part of the case, and by the way, Rob, we ought to run him for some Republican slot somewhere, Matt. He just outlined this perfectly. He really did, of what Republicans used to.
We might have trouble with the social issues on the Republican side these days.
Well, that's okay. It's all changing anyway. So, but yeah, let's go to the point of your question, which is important. At the time, Gingrich, of course, created the contract with America, and a mainstay of that contract with America was balancing the nation's budget. So, yes, there was a groundswell. People were worried. They were worried about who was backing us, what countries held our debt, what they would do to us, how this was hurting generations. Now, I had TV commercials that I ran, and one of them was Danny Boy, which was a great commercial. But it would talk about how this little child had showed a baby, how it would never know that, that Bob Ney was balancing the nation's budget for its future, but you would know as a parent. I mean, that's the extent that, we promoted this in our ads and everything because the people cared about the issue. Now, it's not, when I talk to people, everything ranges from Epstein to, bathrooms to swimming teams and who can be on them or not, and to immigration and Israel, Gaza. That's what you hear. Because I talk to people. People aren't focusing on this $38 trillion, and we have to look at something. And I'll answer, Matt, the 1998 question, but it's an education process to get people back to 1998. We had a lot of people in the country that, went about educating people about government monetization, which, the government sells assets to raise cash, and basically our central bank prints money to buy government debt to do what? To finance spending, okay? So it's a cycle, and that can be okay or not okay. If you look back post-World War II, we, of course, didn't have an inflationary factor that was really, really terrible because the Fed kept the rates low and our growth outpaced our debt, all right? Then you went into the 1970s. You had a lot of oil shocks, Saudi Arabia, the king shut off the oil, all these types of things. And the debt really wasn't the main driver. But then if you go into post-COVID, in our lifetime here, from 2010, 2009 to 2023, so post-COVID and COVID, our debt, our GDP rose from 60% to 130%. So until 2021, when COVID was coming in, inflation itself was low. But then you had the Ukraine, you had COVID, the supply chains, we all heard about that, what was happening, And then, of course, the Fed balance sheet went from 4 trillion to 9 trillion in increased spending. Now, one thing I wanted to say out front, Trump did it, Biden did it, because you hear modern science, well, Biden and Trump, they both spent. One spent more than the other, which was Trump in the first term. And yes, we had COVID, et cetera, et cetera. I just wanted to say all of that because if you're a sitting member of Congress today and you know what I just said, you should know what I just said if you're a sitting member, and you should know what Rob just said because it all makes sense. You're going to look at this whole picture and say, how do we begin? Where do we go? It took a monumental will in 1998, monumental, by Newt Gingrich and John Kasich and a whole crew of people. Dick Armey, our leader, Tom DeLay was our whip. It took an entire force of people to keep people on track, just to balance what we had. We didn't have to balance 38 trillion, but it took a monumental effort, a come to the Lord conversation about every day with people to get it back on track. And we had very painful public votes, and we did a budget. We took an agency, took it to the floor out of the committee, amendments. Now I'm in Tennessee right now. We had John Tanner, Alan Mollahan in West Virginia, who, both of you know very well. He was a former congressman. And people like that, they're Democrats. They voted for some amendments. We had Democrats and Republicans voting on amendments because we did floor amendments, committee amendments, et cetera. So we dissected that budget. Now, why did we do that? We had internal force by our leaders to do it, but I believe a lot of it was because the public was ginned up to get this balanced budget because of what it was going to do to the kids. Now, in today's world, I firmly believe that if you want to talk about inflation and what causes these things, sure, COVID, the supply chains, yes, they were part of it. Gasoline, when it goes up, what happens when you distribute goods through trucks, everybody pays a price. But I firmly believe the unknown factor that nobody really is beating the drum daily on is the fact that this 38 trillion, that is a major inflation factor. It's major. And the current Congress, I think deep down knows, we can't alter this. It can't change. So they're going to do continuing resolutions. If they did a budget, I would be in shock. So we had the stimulus, we had the public support, but we had the leaders. I remember the Democrats at one time, Matt and Rob, were doing the tactics of, every 15 minutes you can call the House to recess, right? That's non-debatable. You have to go vote on it. We were meeting with constituents, the bells would ring. We would run over, we would vote, we would come back. Start our normal business after people waited on us for a half hour. The bells would ring. We would run over, vote to not recess, and come back. Gingrich brought cots in for older members and sat them off the floor of the House so they could actually sleep there. We voted all night long. And he said, if you want to do this, we'll do it. Those were the types of days when, people had this will to get it done. That doesn't even, exist for 10 minutes now.
Well, let me follow up on this because this is great because Congress is not doing that. We could have a whole other episode on how Congress has given away their power over the last 20 years. But
sure,
let's back up on this. How much harder has it come for today's members of Congress to actually govern compared to when you were in Congress from 1994 until 2006? How much harder is it for these members today, given the current structure of social media, fundraising, cable news coverage? 90% of the members of Congress are elected in primaries. When you were there, I would say a third of the districts were kind of swing districts. You came from a swing district. You took over a Democratic district in 1994 when you won your election. So how much harder do you think it is given that the incentives are there pretty much just to win primaries?
Well, I think that's part of it. The dynamic, well, there's a unique dynamic now with Donald Trump in the White House. That's I don't, Bill Clinton had charisma. Ronald Reagan, that was my time. I first ran in 1980 when Reagan ran for president. Reagan had a lot of power. But you had the days at that time of the Tip O'Neills was, Speaker of the House, and then along came Gingrich. I look at Gingrich and O'Neill and some of the different human beings, but some of the same type of light, how they worked. And you would say, oh, well, Gingrich was a bomb thrower. No, Gingrich also, he knew Republicans in union districts that they had a voice. He knew, the pulse of his caucus. So those were all factors. Today, it's a different world. Number one, I believe, and don't get me wrong, there's always been drama people in Congress, but I believe that the amount of theater that has come forth is beyond anything we had. I call it theater. Whether it was AOC who got elected and then she did a sit-in in Nancy Pelosi's office. In my day, you didn't do that. You didn't become a new member and you go sit in Pelosi's office and you're going to demand this and that. There was a kind of a respect to the pecking order of the system. Now, some people would say, well, Bob, that's the good old boy network. But no, it was a pecking order of the system, because, and this might seem trite, me bringing this up, but when AOC did the sit-in her first week and then the press was running to AOC, well, what do you think? As if she was the Speaker of the House. And so the press feeds on some of what I call the entertainment. And you can go to Marjorie Taylor Greene, and some of the antics on the floor during the State of the Union, which, in my day, we didn't have 1/10 of that amount of drama during the States of the Union. I mean, we would have, members would have been told you're not going to do those kinds of things that they do. So that part of the system has become not civil. When I got in trouble, not only did, Republicans call me, I got calls from Democrats that would shock you if I said their names. And a couple of them are still there, that call me on the phone. How's Bobby and Kayla? Do you need anything? Can I lend you some money? I actually, had those. And there was a civility there where people kind of knew each other's families. We did bipartisan retreats together. So you had some of that. That's another factor. In my opinion, though, the modern age of Instagram, instant gratification in America, the modern age of everybody's basically a journalist with their cell phone, the AI, the fact that you can send millions of pieces of correspondence to members' offices, that has all changed the system to put pressure. And the primaries. To get through your primary, you've got to pass a litmus test. You have to pass one. And then I want to go to Trump for a second. That he has been one of the most powerful voices in the day with Reagan and with the Democrats, with Clinton, Republicans with Reagan. They were powerful presidents. But in this era, if you're in the House, I think you have a couple second thoughts about what you're going to do if you go away from the flow, of what the White House thinks you ought to be in.
Well, and they're terrified of him. I've raised money for some of the current Republicans in the House and Senate. I've played golf with the Republican committee chair a couple months ago, and they know that they need his endorsement in their primary, or they could lose their primary. They don't want to be, on Truth Social every night getting blasted by him.
Right.
And they're
Right.
afraid of it. Then, you also look at for House leaders, it used to be that there were carrots and sticks. When you get rid of earmarks, you can no longer threaten a member of Congress that you'll pull their project if they don't support a compromise piece of legislation
Uh-huh.
because
Uh-huh.
they don't care about it. And so, and you really can't punish them anymore. I mean, it used to be if a member got out of line, the speaker might threaten to take away their seat on financial services.
There's always going to be a crash. It's life on planet
Well,
Earth.
well,
There's
and,
ebbs and flows.
and what people forget, we always have rose-colored glasses, but I'll quickly go through that same time period. Um, After President Reagan's historic tax cuts in 81 and 82, the deficit grew so quickly that he actually raised taxes 11 times before he left office.
Yeah.
George Bush Sr., and what I thought was a heroic move, but cost him his job. Um, they did, they worked on entitlement fixes. Um, he also agreed to a tax increase and violated his
Read my
read
lips.
my lips.
Right.
That helped cost him his job. Bill Clinton raised taxes in 93. That's part of what led to the class of 1994 and the Republican Revolution. And, under a lot of pressure, worked with the Republicans to balance budgets in the late 90s. George W. Bush, I mean, after 9/11, all bets were off. The national debt doubled. And then under Barack Obama, he spent a lot. He added to the entitlements, but he worked out a deal that cost John Boehner his job that raised taxes on people earning over $400,000 a year. Well, during that stretch, the economy still grew and the deficit started to shrink. Um, Biden and Trump have been unmitigated disasters on the deficit.
Uh-huh.
They really, neither of them did much to curb it. In fact, at the current pace we're on, if we don't make any major changes, when Donald Trump leaves office in 2029, 38% of the total national debt will have happened under his 8 years. So we have got to get to a point where Republicans find their sea legs again. And, when you look at this current shutdown, it's not just who wins or loses. The American voter right now is kind of like goldfish. We have very short memories. But they do remember who you're fighting for. And one of the things the class of 94 and the Republican Revolution in the mid 90s succeeded in that shutdown. They may have had short-term costs where Bill Clinton got reelected, but that group branded themselves as deficit hawks and fighting for balanced budgets. And that reputation for Republicans, even though I would say it's not warranted anymore, still remains. And so there was a win there. And I think what Democrats are hoping for in this deal is, yeah, in the short term, people are going to say they folded, they lost, but they want to be on the record as seen as fighting for lower health insurance
Yeah,
costs.
no, it's an interesting fight that's shaping up, and it's going to be interesting to see what the president does because he clearly got the memo, I believe, about affordability was the number one issue on voters' minds last Tuesday.
Which is one of the reasons he won in the first place.
Right.
I mean, Donald Trump, a lot of people voted for him in November of last year because Donald Trump was speaking about inflation, food prices, and really drilling on those issues. And so Democrats just took a page out of his book. And because frankly, I mean, Joe Biden was running around saying the economy is great and I'm doing a great job. And no voter gives a shit about GDP's up 2.5% or 3.1%. They don't know.
They care how they feel.
They care how they feel. Are they able to go to the grocery store and get groceries? Are they able to pay their bills and at the end of the month have a couple bucks left over instead of being in the hole by a couple bucks?
Well, Bob, I've got one last question for you, and then you can close it out here. Just how do you think this shutdown is going to affect Chuck Schumer's leadership going forward?
Well,
Rob's right. I think this whole who won, who lost the shutdown is nonsense. At the end of the day, the American people lose when people don't govern. But I do think that Chuck Schumer's in an interesting spot. Do you think he comes out of this stronger, the same, or worse off?
Well, first of all, if Chuck Schumer had not done what he did, which technically, I'm going to say technically, he did this for 4 million some people, and outside of the exchange, in the sense that he talked about what he wanted to do with the DACA, which that vote is still yet to come because it expires in December. But he did it for that. Now, my criticism of that is, if Chuck Schumer would have said, I'm shutting this government down because we have 38 trillion, I'd have been like, hey, for the first time in my life, yeah, Chuck, go for it. But he didn't. He did it for a specific cause because it does help. It triggers with the base. So if Chuck Schumer had not done what he did, guys, to shut the government down, he wouldn't have been probably leader this week. Probably. Democrats would have went crazy across the country. Now, he shut it down, and then they agreed to open it up. Not Chuck, but eight others agreed to open it up. So now he's just getting blasted about that happening. Now, does anybody not think that there was the private Senate dining room? You guys know there is the private room, the House and the Senate. Does anybody not think that Chuck was in there with the senators, the 8 of them who ironically are not up for election for various reasons in 2026? And he probably said, okay, on record, I am really not supporting what you're doing. Wink, wink, wink. But, you got to go out there and do it. You got to do it because Chuck is an old style politician like Mitch McConnell. And in the old days, you could get away with, I fought, but those 8 went out and did it. Well, not in today's world. So either way, Chuck was darned if he did, darned if he didn't. I think that Chuck, like Mitch McConnell, both of them need to just stop it. They need to stop it. They need to leave, both of them. This is becoming ridiculous. But again, with Chuck Schumer, he controls the money. You do a fundraiser for members. I mean, look, you guys know that that's a big part of this. So, having said that, I think Schumer was damned no matter what he did. Either way, eventually he's not going to be able to be leader. He might be able to stay in the Senate like Mitch, but look, we knew Mitch's day was coming as leader, and soon came in. Mitch knew that. So I think Chuck's time as leader, the clock is ticking very rapidly.
I think you're spot on all of that. I think it's time for fresh leadership in general, in getting some new faces out there. I would just simply add to that look, if you're going to take a hostage, and the Democrats decided that Obamacare was going to be the line in the sand, if you plan on winning, at least take a hostage that the other side isn't willing to let die.
Right. Good point.
The
Good point.
the Democrats took Obamacare and thought that the opposition party that voted like 55 times to defund it and kill it was somehow going to give a shit. And so what I've been explaining to my more liberal friends is there was no other way out of this. We weren't going to legislate through a shutdown or through a hostage situation. They were never going to give on this. The point of it was to be seen as fighting and to brand ourselves as fighting on healthcare costs. Now, could we have kept it going another week or another month? Yes, but then you get into the real situation of having planes crashing, SNAP benefits, all these other things.
And I think both sides are feeling the pain of that. Like, I think at some point, right? I mean, both sides are.
This was a good way out of the situation, frankly, for both parties. Now, will there ever be a vote on the ACA subsidies? I don't know. And frankly, for Democrats, it's good either way because if there is a vote and it passes, great, the subsidies stay in place and we can help people. If the Republicans don't hold the vote, we're going to Epstein the shit out of you. The same thing where we say, hey, you guys promised to hold a vote. You won't hold a vote. When the American people see exploding premiums, it's your fault. And so, look, I think the promise of a vote is a joke. The most gullible person in Washington is the member of Congress who walks out of the leader's office and the leader just told him, "Oh, I promise you a vote. If you just shut up now, I'll make sure you I'll make sure your provision gets in the bill." And we all know the speaker might be able to put your provision in a bill this year, but the Senate can just strip it right out, and the speaker still kept his promise. So, look, any Democrat who genuinely thinks that their promise means anything on subsidies is an idiot because not only, even if the Senate holds a vote, and I'll still be surprised if they do, that doesn't mean Mike Johnson.
The Democrats have their campaign issue.
But
They got their
yeah,
campaign issue.
we've got our campaign issue, and if you do have the vote and your guys all vote against it, when premiums spiral, they're going to get drilled in campaign ads. But so I don't necessarily think this was a clear-cut loss for the Democrats because look, if you want to legislate, win elections.
Yeah.
That's what I would tell to my liberal friends. You're not going to legislate through a shutdown with a gun to somebody's head. You want to win elections, you want to appoint Supreme Court justices, you want to get your policy programs. How about you show up to vote and quit, quit bitching?
Well said.
Right. Absolutely. And that comes to the point of the cloture vote, the filibuster, because people ask me, whose fault is this in the Senate? And here's the bottom line of the reopening fault. It's both parties because they have that idiotic, in my opinion, filibuster rule, idiotic. Both parties do it. When they're in the majority, they don't want it, but they keep it because they might be in the minority. It goes back to Rob's point he just made just now. You don't depend on how you legislate on a cloture vote on a filibuster. Elect more people. But, the other reason I blame Republicans, too, I blame Thune, because that's not a constitutional issue. Thune could have brought it, they call it, I love the drama, the nuclear option. Oh, please, guys, you're not JFK profiles in courage, okay? The nuclear option. Thune could have brought that through the conference on a 51 vote margin. He could have brought it and done away with it and opened the government. He could have done that. Now, yes, it would have had to gone to the floor then, and you need the 60 votes to get the debate. But then again, he could have fought that over and over. Trump wanted to do that. He's get rid of that thing. They can't because they got a happy farm deal. It's a good old boy deal. They want to keep it, the majority of them, in case they get in the minority. So that's why I blame both sides on the reopening. Both could have done it a little bit different, and they could have suspended that and then had the normal vote. But that's neither here nor there. That's another separate issue. But it's still part of the process, and that's what bothers me the most. There is no budget process. Until you go back to a budget process, we have no hope of doing anything. And here's one other thing on issues. There's a hemp issue in there. Mitch McConnell put a rider in there about hemp. And now Ron Paul's all angry, in Kentucky. Riders have no business. I don't care what the issue is. ACA, for the Republicans, immigration. Riders have no business in continuing resolutions because it's not a budget process. If you go through a budget process, hey, I love earmarks. And of course, they run these articles periodically. Bob Ney, Duke Cunningham, Jack Abramoff earmarks. That's nothing. Earmarks have a bigger process to them. And if you want to make it clean, then here's the lobby groups who's behind Congressman Ney's earmark, et cetera, do those kinds of things. But the earmarks are what made the system function better. Plus, number two, who better knows somebody from Weirton, West Virginia, your congressman, do they better know what to put into a budget, or some unelected bureaucrat in DC who says, weird, never heard of it, they're not getting anything this year?
Exactly.
Well, and I think that's exactly right. It takes away the carrot that leadership used to have
Right.
to bring members in to vote for tougher packages, to keep the government open, to keep things moving. And I'm really concerned about that because, John McCain would come out and grandstand on against earmarks. But let's say even if a couple percent of the earmarks were wasteful or were stupid, well, I'm willing to absorb that cost as a country
Mm-hmm.
if it means
Right.
passing a budget deal that reduces
Right.
the deficit by,
Right.
100x. Now you can't get to that point. And so I also have a big concern, where we're now in this gerrymandering fight between Texas, California, and it's now spilling out into other states, and both parties are doing it. We're going to have fewer and fewer members who have contested races. And I'll use Bob Ney as a perfect example. I remember when Bob Ney, Bob, when you got elected in 94, um, my home county, Jefferson County, was predominantly Democratic. And but Bob Ney was very popular because Bob was able to present himself as being one of us instead of one of them, as a Valley guy, stand up for steel, working with Democrats on housing affordability, um, and really on a number of issues, a swing vote later on, voting against the Patriot Act, voting against other issues. When you have a tough reelection district, you're going to work harder.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to listen to the other side. You're going to make compromises. And I think that's better for the country than when you live in when you represent a district that, you could screw a dog, post the video on YouTube and get reelected with 68% so long as it's
Mm-hmm.
primary. We,
Mm-hmm.
I am very, very, very fearful of a scenario where 420 of the 435 seats fall into that latter category.
Mm-hmm.
The only other,
Comes back to
yeah,
there's no incentive for Republicans to work with Democrats.
I mean, there's a
Period.
there's a disincentive
Yes.
because the last
Disincentive.
the last thing you want to be accused of in a partisan primary is being weak, of being disloyal to your party or your cause. I mean, right now, the worst thing that could happen to a Republican in any primary is to have Donald Trump endorse their opponent. Um, in
Mm-hmm.
in the 2010 primary, I was a chief of staff to a Democrat in a very Republican district in Idaho, and there would have been nothing better for our campaign than for Barack Obama to endorse our opponent. I mean, or Nancy Pelosi to endorse our opponent. It would have been the best thing that could have ever happened to us as a Democrat. That's changed. So I am very, very concerned about the incentive structure going towards, blow it up. What's the big deal? One other last point, and this goes to Bob's argument on the budgetary issues. You know, we we need to make sure that Congress asserts itself. Congress has to start asserting itself on a whole host of issues. When you pass legislation today, and both sides do this, half of the legislation is punting all the rulemaking and decision making to the executive branch agency. It's lazy legislating. And we've had sort of a brain drain in Congress where I don't think members of Congress have enough staff. I don't think they're able to pay them enough. We've lost a lot of the professionalism and the expertise. We've completely gutted subcommittee power and chairman's power. It's Gingrich started it a little bit.
Yeah.
Pelosi kept every
Mm-hmm.
change. So now what happens is legislation from interest groups from either party gets handed to leadership. The speaker airdrops it on the committee. The chairmen are largely picked based on loyalty to the speaker and ability to raise money for the party. The subcommittees are just smoke and mirrors because the chairman's calling the shot and the chairman's staff director. And so what happens? That legislation that's already written by a partisan group on the left or a partisan group on the right, now members of Congress can merely try to amend a bad bill at the end of the legislative process instead of having a say in the bill at the beginning of the process. That is a mess. We need to restore some power to the committees, have them step up, and I really think that it's affecting bad outcomes. We're debating bad bills that members don't have a say on until it's too late. And I tell my clients this as a lobbyist. Sometimes they want to just hire you once they're in trouble. And I tell them, look, you can treat us like an insurance policy or like a fire department. And if you treat me like a fire department, it may not be successful, but it's going to be really, really expensive for you. If you call me in after the building's already on fire and after you already have your feet, it's going to cost you a lot more. You want me up there every day at the beginning of the process. Right. And Congress needs to do the same thing. They need to assert authority and on the budget, on everything. Yes, of course, when your party's president's in office, yes, you do everything you can to make sure that your president is successful. Because in Congress, if your president's successful and popular, then your party in Congress is likely to be successful and popular. But you're still the Congress. You're still an equal branch. You don't work for the president, you work with the president.
And I would say that Congress has yielded power for years, both parties. We've governed by executive order.
Well, everything's an emergency.
Yeah.
I mean, Donald, each day is a new emergency, the new emergency powers.
Rob makes a couple of points. I know we're probably running out of time, but I just want to dovetail on a couple of things. When we passed the Help America Vote Act, Steny Hoyer was my main sponsor in the House, and he was the number 2 Democrat right behind Pelosi. Okay, who were my sponsors in the Senate? Mitch McConnell, Chris Dodd, and Ted Kennedy. Okay, think about that combination. When we did the Help America Vote Act, it took 2 years. We literally went over the piece of legislation, and Matt knew Chet Kalis. He was my main staff guy for that. We went over it 21 times. And the one thing that I insisted with Steny, and he finally yielded on it, and he understood why, we passed the Election Commission in there. And guess what the bill says? The Election Commission cannot promulgate a rule, because I didn't want an election commission in Washington, D.C., under that bill, that after we passed it, the Election Commission promulgates the rules and says, hey, we're in West Virginia. You guys need to turn your lights on election day at 6 a.m., not 6:30. I didn't want that kind of thing to happen. Neither did Steny. So we perfected a bill that did not allow rulemaking. It's probably, I'm going to say, the only bill or one of the few bills in the last 25 to 30 years that did that. Because Rob makes a point. They pass a bill, then the executive says, okay, here's what you thought, Congress, when you passed this bill. We're going to pass a rule. And then the members of Congress say, well, I didn't mean that. Well, yes, you did, because they turn total power over the executive. So it's how you proceed that is so important for this country. Everybody debates the budget saying, well, Bush gave money back, and this, you can't balance a budget unless you raise taxes, or you can't balance unless you just cut only. There's a whole process in the Congress. When I became chairman of the House Administration and Hoyer was my ranking member, we upped the budget bigger than it's been upped in decades in Congress to have staff. I got somebody that took me on the floor of the House, and he fought me, on it. I had a huge bipartisan vote, and I told Mike Pence, okay, you can go to lunch now. I just beat you on the floor of the House. we went to the chairs. We had an agreement that we needed more staff because do you want to cut the staff of the House or pay them less and let the executive run the whole ball of wax? Anybody that complains about Donald Trump immigration ought to just forget it, because if you don't like what Donald Trump does on immigration, because let's face it, Biden was in a coma on it, and Trump's come in. Yes, it's had some flaws, but the border is tightening up. Why is all that debatable? What did Biden do or didn't do, or what does Trump do or didn't do? It's because Congress doesn't do its job. It doesn't pass comprehensive bills. It'll say, here's an immigration bill. It's not thought out. It leaves it up to the bureaucracy. So Congresses over the decades have made presidents powerful.
Yeah, and you're right. And
that happens on the state level too, across the country. I mean, in Oklahoma, and I'm not criticizing my clients, but oftentimes they're passing bills, and then next thing you know, they have to ask for an attorney general's opinion on what the bill actually means. And there's weight of law. Yeah. So it happens across the board, and I do hope that legislators will across the country, state level,
well, and if Congress doesn't assert itself, and this is how it comes full circle, one of, I think, my favorite votes of yours when you served in Congress was being one of 3 members of the House that voted against the Patriot Act. And I know
that was a tough one. Yeah.
After 9/11, you took a whole heap of shit for that vote.
Oh yeah.
And I think it took a lot of courage because you didn't trust the government to always make the right decisions. And so my cautionary tale for what we're going through right now with the unprecedented power that President Trump is wielding, my cautionary tale for Republicans is, I know you trust Donald Trump with this authority, but are you going to trust the next Democrat who wields this kind of power? Because trust me, my friends are watching every single move, and they're keeping tabs, and they will do the same thing. And so the question I would leave open-ended is, if this is what the limited government party that hates government is willing to do with power and the use of the state, imagine what my friends who love government are going to do. Because it's coming.
Well, I guess we'll wrap up with that. What do you think, Bob?
Yes, thanks for having me on. It's a great issue. It's important. I know the country's not in a groundswell about it, but I'll give you a lot of credit for bringing the issue to the forefront. And let me just say, too, in closing, that you two are, and you're going to think I'm, exaggerating this, but you two are heroes of mine because you've had careers, you've used common sense, and you've done things in a very decent, civil way for your different sides of the aisle, to promote people that you believe are going to make the system better. So I just got to give you credit. So proud of both of you.
Well, we owe a lot to you. I don't think either of us would have had the careers we've had or had them. Certainly, we would not have had them escalate as quickly as they did if you didn't pluck us out of the valley and give us a big opportunity in Washington, D.C. at young ages.
Well,
and teach us a lot.
Happy to do it. And I just thank you for
Southern Hills Country Club today. Back when I was 20 years old.
We got to get you on the golf course.
Oh no, that one cost me 30 months of my life and about $5 million. Nope. Thank you.
We'll see you.
Well, Congressman, thank you for your time, and thank you for everybody.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Golfandpolitics.com, golfandpolitics.com. Sign up for our email newsletter. Follow us anywhere you get social media or get content. We're very appreciative of everybody that gives us a listen, and we'll keep bringing you great content. Thanks again, Congressman. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you.